Welcome back. This is the sixth and final session in our training on creating our Shiny applications and dashboards. I would like to thank the Bureau of Justice Statistics for making the training possible. Welcome, Dr. Ashmead. As you know, Dr. Ashmead is a senior statistician at NORC at the University of Chicago. So we'll just go ahead and turn it over to you, Dr. Ashmead.
Thank you very much. Sorry, trying to share my screen and I lost where the mute button was there temporarily. Hope everyone is doing well today. Got exciting kind of final uh, session here today. We're going to be talking about R Markdown, a little bit of Quarto, automating reports. So this is a little bit beyond just the initial Shiny stuff, but there'll be a Shiny component in this eventually. So we can go ahead and get started. Before we get into the material for today, just kind of revisiting where we were last week. We talked about authentication, building it in the hosting platform, or options to build it with our Shiny app, implementing suppression rules, and some best practices. Um, just wanted to check if any questions come up around that anyone had before we jump into the new stuff today that wanted to revisit. We'll also have a little bit of time at the extra time at the end today in case there's any questions. So, okay. So if you have anything, feel free. We can talk about it at the end. I do want to remind folks that there is a final assignment. You can find the details in the on the GitHub in the final assignment folder. This HTML document has the information about what you need to do in terms of making an example Shiny dashboard with the recidivism challenge data and some of the components that we're looking for. If you got questions on that, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is in here as well. So um, today, so we're going to talk a little bit about what R Markdown is and Quarto. Talk about some of the basics, some of the different uh, document types you can make, how you can include the interactive widgets that we have learned about in previous sessions that we have been using already in our Shiny dashboards. We'll talk about plugging, combining this with our Shiny, and then lastly, a little bit on Quarto. So, before we get into the R Markdown portion of things, it's important to understand like what that's built on. So a lot of this is built on something called Markdown without the R, which is just a lightweight markup language. And so what that means is basically it's a way to write plain text, meaning just like a text document that gets interpreted or turned into formatted text. I'm not totally sure of a lot of other things that would be considered lightweight markup languages. I don't know. I use LaTeX in my own academic work sometimes. I don't know if that's necessarily lightweight, but it is another way kind of plain text gets turned into formatted text. So different than your Microsoft Words of the world. It's been around since 2004, so not really that long, which kind of surprised me as I was doing some background research for the content today. And it is used in a variety of different software applications already. So if you're familiar with like a GitHub, you'll know that you can write Markdown in and it gets interpreted in the websites for GitHub. You may not know this, but if you have Microsoft Teams for your work. I know that you can use some markdown commands within the text to do things like bolding and writing code in your messages to teammates. And I'm sure plenty of other applications, you can do that kind of thing as well. So it's a neat thing to try to see if it works on your particular your application. So that's Markdown. So if you see something with a .md, that just means a Markdown file extension. Um, so the important portions of this, because R Markdown is going to be built on top of this, is kind of some of the underlying syntax. So you might have seen this kind of thing before. To make things italic, we put these stars around it. To make something bold, 2 stars. We can do links with brackets around the piece that is kind of the highlight, and then parentheses with the link. We can also make lists. Um, so all that would get rendered as this following. So italic, bold, this link, so those are kind of some of the basics of syntax, Markdown syntax that we'll use also in our R Markdown or Quarto. So R Markdown has been around since 2014, so a little over 10 years. So it is a way to combine that Markdown language with our code, kind of utilizing both aspects of that. It's built on top of this R Markdown package, which is something which exists only in R. Um, and there are two important components of kind of how this works. So the first is a knitter package, which is used to render our code output into a Markdown file type. Then the second piece is what a program that is outside of R, which is called pandoc, which is used to convert Markdown to many different output formats. So this can convert things from HTML or into HTML, Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, PDF, lots of things as we're going to observe. Pandoc you can run on its own too if you're interested. It's good for things other than just Markdown to other documents. I believe it can kind of go back and forth between a lot of things. So it's kind of a powerful little tool if you're interested. But those are the underlying kind of pieces. So this is kind of the visual of what's happening underneath in the system. So we have this RMD file, R Markdown. We use this, it uses this knitter package to turn that into a Markdown file. That Markdown file gets read by pandoc, and pandoc can turn it into one of these many different output formats. So that is kind of a good sense. So you may see like you can save some of these intermediate files if you pick the right options when using R Markdown, but they may like also flash temporarily and get deleted as temporary files. But that's kind of underlying what's happening. So sometimes if you really need to fix something or try to find some mistakes, you can look at the Markdown file itself before it gets uh, turned into the final output. Okay, so we're just going to touch on Quarto here, and then we'll get to more of it at the end. So Quarto is billed as the next generation of R Markdown. It allows for a different additional languages outside of just R, though I think R Markdown does you can utilize some things other than R now, and engines other than knitter. So knitter can be replaced with some other engines here as well. But it fundamentally works the same as R Markdown. Um, Now we'll have something called a QMD file, a Quarto file. It goes to knitter, gets turned into a Markdown file, and then pandoc turns it into its final output. I find it slightly amusing that um, they stylized R Markdown with a capital R MD, and Quarto they abandoned that, just lowercase QMD across the board. So I don't know why. I just found that intriguing as I was working on this. Um, the big thing with Quarto is it can be run outside of R, so it's not as tied to the R language as R Markdown. And I think a lot of that has to do with, RStudio, or sorry, Posit now is the folks that are developing this, and they're trying to have work on things outside of just R itself, so Python and other languages. So it is less tied to that single R language than R Markdown was. So we'll get back to some of the differences there, but we're going to mostly focus on the R Markdown. So what are our use cases? So there's lots of things, different things you can do with these R Markdown files. That can include things like if you need to have a reproducible report that can be easily rerun with updated data. So say, you have some sort of report that you make every week or month or even 6 months. If all, that's changing can kind of be either the underlying data that gets updated during that time or just like the date or some small parameters, R Markdown can be a great way to do that. So you don't have to, um, rerun everything and then copy and paste graphics and tables into Microsoft Word documents or however you're making your report. So you can make reproducible reports very easily this way. We can use different parameters and produce a large number of reports with different inputs, but the same formatting. So another use case that I have seen or I have used is that, maybe you have a project that has a bunch of different stakeholders or sites or everyone needs to get their own report with their own data. So another way I've used it is kind of parameterizing um, the stakeholder or the site. And so all that would happen is we can produce 50 different reports pretty quickly just by kind of looping through the different sites and subsetting to the right one and putting the right title and that kind of a thing, rather than manually taking the effort and making an individual report of each one. It's also great for teaching when you need to include code. These slides that you're looking at, this HTML, is actually written in Quarto. Um, so it's a great way to include code in your slides as well, rather than, a traditional PowerPoint or something like that. Um, and you can also take advantage of HTML related features. So we're going to be talking about some like the widget stuff we've encountered in R Shiny that we can use. You can also make, full scale websites or kind of HTML versions of books using R Markdown or Quarto. So there's a lot of great things you can do with this. So probably not even covering all of them, but there is many options. Okay, so let's kind of get into the basics. So we're going to start with our R Markdown document. It's going to look a little bit different than the .r files that we have been using before. It's this capital R lowercase md file extension. It is still just a text document that is just kind of telling us what kind of file it is. So we're going to open up this example one in RStudio that is in our code. This was basically the default template that comes in RStudio, plus I made a couple of changes, and we're going to knit that R Markdown and seeing what that looks like. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going into session 6, the examples, and example 1, not the Quarto version. We're going to come back to that. Okay, so here we are in example 1, and we'll take a look at the code in a moment, but for now, I'm going to knit it. So you can either do this with a keyboard shortcut, Control Shift K, or you see this knitting needle if you're in RStudio. If you just click on that, it should render. Okay, you'll see that it appears here in your viewer if you're using RStudio, but if we look back in our folder, it should also create this HTML document with the same name, example1.html. It's gonna be a little easier for us to look at it in that actual HTML document rather than this viewer here. So we can take a look at that. And we get a nice little HTML file. We got some basic R built-in data sets, title, summary of cars, plot in here, and a little bit of text down here. So let's go back to the actual RMD file and take a look what's in there. So you can see we have this portion up here, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. This is called the YAML header. It tells some instructions about kind of like the title and the parameters that you're giving the document. We have these code chunks, which we'll talk about, which are where we're putting our R code. You can see we have some markdown options. So this is some of the markdown code for a second level header. You can see we have the italicized or the bolded text here with knit, and some more code and more sections, and then some more text at the bottom. And we'll explain this last piece because you might not be as familiar with it. So let's start with a couple components that we saw in here. The first one is the YAML header. So YAML stands for yet another markup language. So I guess that is another example of a lightweight markup language. I'm not 100% sure. But we use that at the top of the document to control settings for that whole document. And so it's surrounded by blocks of 3 dashes. And the way this is going to work, we'll get to see some more extensive examples, but it's basically we make lists inside of the different options we give it. So we're going to control things like the document title, the output options, the formatting, and the code rendering. So you can see here in our first example that we saw today, we just told it the title was untitled. We said the output was HTML underscore document, and the date was the 15th. And so we're going to come back to additional options later. But we're going to find out that the spacing here is important as well. Okay, so the next component is R code chunks. So we can insert R code by placing it between this forward, I guess, I guess I don't know what this symbol is called. Forward apostrophe, 3 of them, and then this R in curly brackets, and then closing it again with another 3 of those forward apostrophes. We can also give these chunks names, which can be helpful for finding them kind of in the code. But they have to be unique. So you can give it a second kind of argument here. I believe it does have to be a single text string, which is why I've used underscores here. So whatever happens in these code blocks gets executed in R. And is one way we can incorporate R in there. So if we look at our example, we'll actually see, so we have this R cars. The second one here, R pressure, we have this comma echo equals false. So the other thing you can do as for in these code chunks is set additional options that only apply to that chunk of code. These can be separated by commas, so we can do things like control whether the code is actually run. So this would be an example where you might want to use this is if you're teaching and you don't actually want to run the code in the R Markdown, you just want to show what the code is. Include. Um, and also I should note that by default, the defaults are what I have in the parentheses here, but we can set it to false. So it will be true unless we set it to false. We can also choose whether we want to include the code and or the output. So sometimes you may want to run a bit of code at the top of your document that doesn't need to be output at all. So that's a good option to do that. We can control whether the code is shown in the output at all. So in that particular example here, where we've plotted this pressure data set, you can see we've set echo to false. So if we look at the actual HTML document, you'd see, for example, this summary cars where we didn't do it, didn't use that option. The code is actually shown, but here in my plots, this pressure plot, the code for plotting it is not shown at all, but just the output. Okay. We can also sometimes in your R code or R code output, there'll be certain messages or warnings that will pop up. If you want to suppress those from getting shown in the output of your R Markdown, you may need to use these message equals false or warnings equal false as well, just to make it look a little cleaner. So those are some of the options we can use with the R code chunks. We can also change the defaults for the entire document. So like if it gets very annoying to have to write a particular option over and over and over again within our code chunks, each individual one, sometimes it's better to change the kind of the default options at the top of the document. We can do that with this knitr options chunk set, where you would change that default behavior. So if you wanted to kind of never show the code, you would change this echo equals false, or like message equals false would turn off those messages for all of the code chunks. So text and formatting using Markdown. So we talked about some of those Markdown conventions that we can use. And I believe I glossed over it, but I did mean to show this larger reference for all the different Markdown things you can do. Different heading levels, bolding, italices, bold and italices, block quotes, lists. There's all kinds of things you can do in R Markdown up to some degrees, but I figure it's easier to link to that than trying to list all of those options out in the slides. Okay, so that's there if we need to use that. But all of those R Markdown or those Markdown options should work in our document. Some Markdown conventions take on special meaning in these in our document, especially headers. So that we use these symbols with the pound symbol for a kind of a first or second or third level header. Depending on the output type that we're going to use, they're going to mean different things. So, for example, in some of the slides options, these are going to be markers for different slides in our presentation. When we go to the Flex dashboard, they can mean different tabs within our dashboard or different rows or columns within a tab in our dashboard. So those are going to take on an important meaning as well. Just a heads up there. But otherwise, in like this HTML document, they're just normal section headers. And that would be true for basically any document as well. The last thing to point out, the type of usage would be and way to use R is what's called inline R output. So I'll say if you've used R Markdown a little bit before, you may not even have come across this because I find a lot of people don't know that you can do this kind of thing. Meaning, and when we say R inline R output, we mean output from R interweaved with the actual text in the document. So so assume we did some analysis someplace, and at the end we had an R object that said was result, and its value was 5.2. If you were doing like an automatic report where you wanted that to be, you wanted to say, um, the table 3 has the final mean of the variable is 5.2 or something in the actual text paragraph. You could do that with R Markdown with this inline text. So we use this syntax where you do the forward apostrophe again, but then you write R and then the variable within R that you want to display. So for example, if we had our Markdown document that said in line that just said the result of the first analysis is our result, where we had already assigned result equals 5.2 earlier, we would get the result of the first analysis 5.2. So we did that in that last piece here. So you'll see here's an example of inline R output. The first car has speed R car's speed 1, which is just pulling from that car's data set the first value, and distance our car's dist 1. And if we look at the actual HTML file, you'll see that those get rendered as 4 and 2 respectively, which are if we were to look at cars, we would see, yeah, 4 and 2 respectively. So that can be a really useful way to combine our output with your text as well. And if you're, using this to write a paper or something, you can use it in that way as well, not just to make plots and tables. Okay, so let's go on to the different output formats next. So this list is not exhaustive, but some of the basic ones that you may come across in terms of using R Markdown, we can make a variety of different document formats. So an HTML document like we've done here, a PDF document, a Word document, Microsoft Word. We can also make slides or presentations. We can make PowerPoints, Beamer, which is something that is a PDF format that comes out of LaTeX. And there's also several HTML presentation formats that you can make. Slidey, reveal.js, and something called IO slides. This that we're using in this document is actually a reveal.js type. So it comes with, I know we haven't really used it, but it has some extra fun tools that come with the HTML portion of it, as well as like these code and being able to scroll and all that kind of good stuff. So I think underutilized method of making slides probably is to make HTML slides. You can do some cool things in them that you can't do with PowerPoint. Other things you can make, we're going to be talking about this Flex dashboard, which is an HTML type of document later on. You'll also see people use this to make websites. There's an R package called Blogdown that you can use to turn these things into websites or books with an R package called Bookdown, which you can make HTML type books, basically. So lots of different things that we can do. Okay, so to change our document format, we just need to update that YAML header. So we have examples 2A and 2B. We're going to make a PDF document and a Word document. That's the only thing we're going to change from the current version of our test document here. So and all we had to do that is to change that output with these two arguments. So let's take a look at what those do. So I'll open those up. So here's 2A, it's the PDF document. Otherwise, everything is exactly the same. I click knit. RStudio now has a PDF viewer, which don't love that much. So I'll open this up separately. But we get this nice PDF of the same thing. It has the title, it has the date, it has our plot and our inline R usage as well. We can also do this in Word and knit it. And I don't actually have a copy of Word installed on this computer, but you can see um, with its free version here, you can see a little bit of the document here. So it's going to use those headers using kind of some of the defaults in Word to make this as well. So the only thing we've changed is that YAML header, and we've got two different kinds of documents, the same otherwise exact content. Exactly, which is really nice. Can kind of change on the fly pretty rapidly. Um, so within those different types of document formats, there are a bunch of additional or specialized settings that can be added to that YAML header. Um, we're going to get into those options with just another note. The indents and the spacing of those indents here becomes really important because that YAML reads things as kind of like a list within a list. I'll explain in a moment with a good example. But just re-emphasizing that if something's not working, it could be the spacing of your options in your YAML header. So we're going to focus on the HTML options here. Um, so we can bring in a table of contents into our HTML document. We can use a theme and change kind of the colors and the underlying text. These are actually going to be the same exact themes that we're using in Shiny. We can control default figure sizes, its height and its width. We can do something called adding code folding, which means we can show or not show the code. And another good trick too is you can actually use our output in the YAML header itself. So for example, if I didn't want to hard code the date into my document, I can use R and use its system date to dynamically update the date to the right day whenever you're rendering the document. So you can see that I actually, to do that, so now here I'm changing my title. We'll change this to my analysis. Uh, we can add an author line, that date. We use that same kind of inline R syntax to do that here. So that single apostrophe R, and then within that, the R code that we use. And then the big difference is we're just surrounding that by quotations here. And then all our options for the HTML output. So before we had this HTML document on this line here with output, now because we're going to add options to it, we actually it's kind of like an embedded list. So it's like one indent. The HTML document is an element of the output, And this table of contents then is an element of the HTML document and kind of a level of the list. So each of these use table of contents, table of content depth, um, float. These are all elements at the same level, the HTML document, as each other. So they go on the same indentation line. Um, Whereas HTML document is an option of the output. So that just takes a little bit to get used to, but it's important to line up those that spacing, which isn't normally something that's a big deal in R. So it might not be as familiar to you, but spacing is important here. Okay, so the options we're adding here, we're going to add a table of contents. We have an option to say that the depth of that table of contents is 2, meaning like what level of header it's going to read in there. We're going to have it have this option where it's floating across our document. We'll also use some numbers for our sections. Before we didn't have any numbered sections. I'm going to change the theme, set some default figure widths and heights, and turn on this option called hide for code folding. So this is all in example 3. So all I did was change those options in the YAML, and let's see what that looks like. Okay, so instantly you see here is our floating table of contents. So by floating, it means I can scroll and it stays here, and it actually also tells me um, the what where I am in the document at the same time. So the depth has to do with those the level of headers. So if I change the depth to like 3, it would show, I guess, subsections here as well in the table of contents, not just the first level sections. You can see I get numbers now. Um, you can see, so my code folding, um, you can see actually get this option that says show all code or hide all code. So if you were teaching or something like that, you could use this to turn on or off, or if you're some sort of reporting where people are interested in how you're doing the analysis, you could you could hide the code by default, but for people that don't care about the code, but then for those people that want to see how you did it, you could have that option to show it without being kind of distracting. You can see the colors changed here for that Yeti option. What else did we change? The figure widths, I believe we're just setting that's coming into play with this plot, just how kind of tall and wide it is by default. And like the figure widths is something you can change in within every single code chunk as well. But this sets it for the whole document at the top there. You can also, pick your favorite theme here. For example, I just know this one off the top of my head as well. Very easy way to change the color as well. I think I've seen some things too where it has all of the options and you can actually change it within the document, which is kind of cool. Yeah, so those are a lot of like some basic HTML document options. There's a whole host of them available in the documentation as well, that you can see. So next, let's try this reveal.js slide option. Um, so if you, I can't remember if I put this in the install packages list, but if you don't have it, you'll need an install.packages reveal.js. This is just one of several HTML presentation frameworks. I'm not going to go over all of them. They all work and function slightly different. This is the one that I've used the most and I've liked the most. Most of these use this convention that um, the first header level, so one pound sign, is going to mark sections within your slides. The second header level is going to actually mark different slides. And the only thing I need to do to change it is to change it to this reveal JS, two colons to call the package, and then reveal JS presentation. Um, so let's take a look at what that looks like. Everything else actually is exactly the same. I can knit it. This pops up here, but we can also open it in the browser. You can see by default, we get this kind of funny slide transition here as well, and these markers to move between slides. What's interesting about Reveal JS slides is you can actually have slides in multiple dimensions, not just left and right. Um, you can have slides up and down as well, which is a little bit strange, but um, I've used it in one circumstance where it kind of had a default presentation that would you would normally go to, but all the slides had a kind of hidden down direction slide, which had more details if you wanted to see them for the presentation. So it's kind of a cool thing as well. But this is an HTML document that you can use. So we're going to be talking about widgets and some of the tools that we've been using, Plotly and um, the leaflet maps and the data tables, all that you can embed in a presentation if you want with this kind of HTML tool, which is very neat. Um, so that's the basics. You can see here, I'm just using those the second level header to mark these different slides between them. But otherwise, exactly the same content that we've been using. Okay, so that's Reveal.js. Okay, next let's talk about something that's been a little bit closer to what we've been doing so far, which is the Flex dashboard. If needed, you may need to do an install.packages, Flex dashboard. Um, this is an R package to make HTML documents, and it can be used with or without Shiny reactive elements. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that next. The big thing to note is it's less fully enabled, I would say, than our shiny dashboard. When we do the shiny elements, I'd say it's kind of dashboard light. You can't adjust things quite as well as you can with the actual R shiny dashboard. So I've tended not to use that in the R shiny context, but have used it to make kind of HTML documents that are more transportable than a full-fledged R shiny dashboard. So let's start with just changing the output. So all we're doing is changing the YAML header once again. So flex dashboard flex dashboard in example 5. Otherwise, I'm not changing the content one bit. There's a couple examples in here. I'm actually looking at this one without any other additional underscores. Um, why aren't you opening for me? Okay, there we go. So let's knit this. And you can see we get an HTML document. Okay, Now we get something that looks a lot closer to what we've been doing with our Shiny. We get a little bit of a header here. We get some columns, and we get our content in each of the columns. I think this kind of looks like some standard, if you go to like an academic conference, very standard like 3 or 4 column presentation that you may see on a giant poster there. Um, just in the way it's laid out by default. But this is the exact same content that we've been doing before. Some text, some R code with this table, or this just the summary and this plot, and our inline our text. So by default, our layout is column based. You can kind of see that here. We have these 4 columns. Um, Those columns, the second level header is what's defining those columns. So before, when we were talking about the reveal.js, that second level headers were our slides. Now there are columns. Um, the first level header marker, so $1 is generally going to create different pages or tabs within the Flex dashboard so that we can see that with this example that we've made here. So all I've done is add this um, first page here, second page here that I've added on here. I'll knit that. All right, so now what we see is some of the content. Now we just have 2 columns on that first tab, and now we have a second page, which also has 2 columns with our plot and our additional text. So that's an easy way to make multiple pages to separate our content, much like we were doing with our Shiny dashboards. We can also use third level headers to create boxes within those columns. So let's see what that looks like with this example, this other example 5. Third level. So all I've done there is I've added this third level pressure plot and cars plot before that content. So now I can see that this pressure plot gets its own little like extra box here that's labeled. And so same thing with the cars plots. It just kind of helps divide up the content a little bit better. So yeah, that's what that third level header does there. Okay. Additional options. So instead of having second level headers define rows, we can switch it so second level headers define sorry, instead of them having them being columns, we can have them be rows. Sorry for the typo there. By adding this option orientation rows. So here again, we're using this indentation. So this orientation rows is like an option within this Flex dashboard, kind of like we did for the HTML documents. Let's take a look at what that looks like now. Rows. All right, this one's kind of ugly because we haven't changed the content at all. It wasn't structured very well to be in rows, but you can see the content was the column before is now this row. Same thing with the second page. This part isn't quite as bad, but we'd probably want to update some of the layout for that a little bit better. All right, one other option, last one, that we can do is called the storyboard layout. So this is a really good option if you are using this as a tool for kind of visualization, but you also want to have some commentary written down, so much like a storyboard. Um, so what's different about this is that the slides within the storyboard are going to be defined by third level headers, and then we're going to have the commentary that's separated by these three dashes. And we'll look at an example here. So in the actual R Markdown, so here's a good example. So I have third level, including plots. I have my plot. Put these three dashes, and then I have some sort of commentary about that. This plot shows the pressure increase as the temperature increases. I'll knit that. Storyboard. Okay. So here we get our different slides at the top that were defined by those third level headers, our markdown, knitting, and including plots. So I didn't put the dash 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 commentary on this one, so nothing shows up over here. For knitting, I put it but didn't fill it in. So it'll still exist if you don't write any commentary. And then here's the example of writing something in there. So that can be a good option as well if you're looking into kind of a slideshow mixed with a dashboard to some degree. Okay, so there's a ton of extra documentation for these Flex dashboards, especially in terms of the layout, that I would just consult here. In addition, this is kind of what we were doing before with these stacking. There are additional options you can put in here. So you can control the height, the exact height of like the rows or the columns, the height or the width of the rows and columns by putting that additional option. One thing I'll note when I was playing around with it before, we had been using in the examples this 2 pound signs to be the second level header. This long dashed line is a different way to represent that. And for whatever reason, I couldn't get these additional options to work with the pound sign. So I think you may have to do it with use these other way of representing headers for it to work. Um, so you can kind of use all these combinations to make different layouts here. You can also make tab sets within them representing the different header information or different combinations of them as well. So, and we talked about pages. So additional options there, but it's not quite as customizable as our Shiny work, but there is quite a bit you can do. The other good thing about this is we can use our HTML widgets, which we talked about, within any of these products. So our DT data tables, our plotly plots, our leaflet maps. So we can do this. We can allow user interactivity in terms of those HTML widgets with the content without explicitly having this R Shiny piece in the background. What's really good about that is as long as it's an HTML document without the R Shiny part, I can email that to somebody that is interested in seeing it. So it makes it a lot lighter weight and transportable with still having kind of some cool and useful dashboard components embedded within it. So let's do an example of this. And because we've used all those tools before, Plotly, DT, Leaflet, I'm not going to go over kind of the syntax of how to use those. Actually, for better or for worse, we can drop our example that we've been using for R Shiny pretty directly into these R Markdown formats. Um, but the only difference is rather than using the dynamic input output aspect of Shiny, we have to use specific um, values of those inputs rather than kind of making it dynamic. Um, and this can be a really good option if the number of inputs is small to turn this into this kind of flex dashboard rather than an R Shiny type of document. Like I said, easier to share this HTML document than figuring out how to host Shiny. One thing you do have to watch out for is when you do this, it actually embeds the data inside the HTML document in order for it to be shared. So if you make one of these HTML documents, it can get really large if you include a lot of different things in there. So it can get to a point where it may be difficult to email it still. Because the file is too large, or take a long time to open. So just something to watch out for there as well. So I put a lot of this content, our Florida arrest data example, into example 6. So let's take a look at what that looks like. I'm going to run this. I'm going to knit this, and then we'll come back to the code in a moment. So this one takes a moment because it's actually doing a little bit more work. There we go. Okay. What do we have here? So we have a data table here, our DT data table. Um, I have done some tabulations of arrests, degree by sex, and this has all the DT options that we built into it. I can sort. I can change the column visibility in here. I can even download this as a CSV, Excel, or PDF within it, which is very cool. Um, I can scroll. All those good things that was built into DT we can use here in our HTML document as well. I also have this plotly plot that I've put down here of this same data. And everything that we were doing in Plotly with our Shiny dashboards, we can use here. Um, it hovers. I can turn on and off um, the different portions of the plot. I can download the plot as a PNG. I can zoom. I can select all that kind of good stuff we can do within this HTML format. And I've also put our map on the second page here. So this is our leaflet map that we're doing before. I've done a map of the third degree arrests per 10,000 persons in each of the counties. So just like before, I can zoom, I can hover. It has all the same kind of interactivity that we had in the um, dashboard. The one difference here, right, is we can't recompute for some other combination of values where we have a fixed set of values, but within that we have some level of interactivity. So I've sometimes called this as kind of like a dashboard light version in that we can have some things that people expect in dashboards. We just can't recompute things because we're not tied to R. Okay, so let's take a look at the code that got us there. All right, so what I'm using here, yeah, Flex Dashboard. I'm putting it in rows here, actually. One thing I want to point out here, this happens by default that it is self-contained, that everything ends up in this HTML document. This makes it so I can just email it to you or put it in a file drive, but it makes for it transferable. If we were to change this to false, which I feel like it used to be the default, or we're going to see in Quartro that I think that is still the default. Um, it actually doesn't package things up into one document. So it's just something to watch out for. Um, yeah, we get this extra files, which has a bunch of like all the code that runs these widgets. And if you sent someone this HTML document now, without all this extra stuff, it wouldn't work the same way. But it makes this HTML a lot smaller. So this is where kind of the size of this can add up. So not only does this embed the data in it, but it embeds all like this widget stuff. So the file size gets ends up to be a lot larger um, when we make it self-contained. So that we don't need to do this by default. It's the default option, but I just wanted to show you that quickly. So it's a something to watch out for if you're not aware of it. So you'll see this was like 4 MB before, and now it's up to 13 because it has put all of that extra widget stuff inside of the document itself. Okay. Um, so self-contained is true. So here I'm doing a setup chunk and I have include equals false. So this is where I'm like loading the data, basically what was in our global before, not actually outputting anything. So this include equals false means none of this shows up in the output. So this is like our same global code that we were using before, loading the data, doing a little bit of light um, filtering and joining with the geographic data for the mapping. I've put our create data tab that we worked on last time for our suppression in here. And then I have data analysis at that first level header. This creates the different pages. And then table as a different row. And then I'm actually creating the data that is going to go in our DT, and then just kind of similar DT syntax, data table syntax that we used before in our dashboards. Similar thing for our plot. I'm just using that information and putting it in a plotly object. And then similar thing for the map as well. Similar code that we were using before with leaflet. And that's it. So it makes it pretty relatively easy to go back and forth between the different options. And we have this nice dashboard light of our data as well. Okay. Next, we're going to go into our R Shiny bit, combining it, but I'll pause there in case any questions. Okay, great. So let's talk about combining Shiny with R Markdown. Um, so it is an option to combine R Markdown with Shiny to allow for dynamic inputs and outputs like we were doing before in our apps and dashboards. Um, however, it's important to know that you need to have R running in the background to make this work. So it means we can no longer just send someone an HTML and this will work. Again, you'll need to be in a situation where you'll need a server to host the document or dashboard in this way. This will work for any of the HTML formats that we've talked about, slides, or should work for most for them, but only for the HTML ones, not your PDFs or your Microsoft Word documents. So to allow this to work, you need to add an option to the YAML that is says runtime :shiny at the top level option. So we'll see an example of this, but not indented at all. Then you can place UI widgets, so like our select inputs and render statements to have our outputs directly in the code chunks. We no longer need those kind of output functions, actually. You can do it all with the render functions. Some observations. So I don't typically use this combination of Shiny and R Markdown in my own work. Um, it is more difficult. I found it pretty difficult to actually control all the sizing and the spacing of the Shiny app. So I tried to duplicate what we had been doing in Shiny in this app with we had like 5 or 6 different inputs. Um, and I found it can be difficult to kind of control the size and of that with the options that are available in R Markdown, just because there aren't as kind of complete options to control that stuff. Or it is more difficult, probably. You probably can do it, but you have to write more custom code. Um, if you just have a couple inputs and outputs, I think this would work better. Um, but if we have a lot, it may be preferable to be in that full-fledged R Shiny kind of setup. So let's see what that looks like. This is example 7. Okay, so now rather than knit, this actually knows that I can't knit it, but I can run it. So you can see here, I still have flex dashboard. Vertical layout scroll is something I added to try to fix some of the UI components. And here's that runtime shiny that I've added in here. So let's look at this first, and then, oh, this and then we'll look at the code a little bit more in depth. Takes a moment to render. One important thing that's going to happen, we are going to get we have to look at this kind of within the context of our studio. So I'm going to open it here. So you'll see that rather than just like opening an HTML document, I need to have it connected to the kind of the R server like we were with Shiny. That's the piece that is connecting connective tissue between R computing the underlying changes and the actual HTML dashboard. So you can see I have my calendar widget here, select the dates, our choose a variable to analyze, our grouping by another variable, show percent, remove missing calculations, and then our update button. All of that works, gives us updates the table and the plot. That one has a lot of options. Okay, that has this one has fewer options. There we go. All of that works. This is what I was saying about it's like it gets a little bit the UI gets a little bit strange. I found it pretty difficult to control kind of how all these inputs worked. But we can get it all in here, and it all works correctly, exactly as our dashboard did. What does that look like for the code? How did I make that happen? I actually kind of just dropped our dashboard code in here more or less. Again, this piece was most of what was in global in this on my setup here where I didn't include the output. I included our functions, our loading the data, suppression criteria. Um, you can see here, this is where I had to switch over to the different options for the second level headers because I was trying to get everything to fit on the screen a little bit better, but the default options were not working great. So here you can see I'm giving it the outcome variable options that we were using before, the grouping variables, the map options. So here's my first, so data analysis was my first page. Inputs was my first row. So you can see the third level header for a box within the row. So you can see there I'm using this date range input, which was just one of our Shiny functions. And then I have these other inputs just separated by those third level headers in these different R chunks. Same exact code before, just with these UI components. Um, each of them in their own box. There's my action button. All right, and then the next row I had was the table. And again, so I made my reactive table data using the function. I can still have reactives that reactive objects that are kind of our intermediaries between everything. That and the plot title I just dropped right in there. Um, and here you can see I have next thing I did was render the data table. I no longer need to render it to an output object and then display the output object. I just render it and it shows up. And so nothing after that. So, and then my third row was the plot and commentary. And you can see another render plotly, um, exactly the same code that we're actually using in the dashboard. I've put in there in the R map. So we definitely can use this to make an R Shiny dashboard at runtime. It just has some limitations, in my opinion, in terms of the kind of like the UI layout that you can use there. Okay, any questions on the R Shiny connection there? All right, so let's spend just a little bit of time on Quarto. So we talked about how this is very similar to R Markdown. There are just actually a couple of small differences. We're gonna also still use a YAML header in the syntax. Header, there's just a couple different, slightly different syntax that you use within the YAML header and the options. The second thing that's different is the way you specify options in the code chunks. Otherwise, everything is otherwise exactly the same. You use the markdown the same, the code chunks the same. Um, Everything else is pretty easy to transition from one to the other. Another thing that's slightly different, you can render Quarto documents from the command line in addition to RStudio. This is kind of minor, but some of the options to put parts, multiple component Quarto documents together works better from the command line, I've found. There was a good question at the end of our last section about when I said you should download that Quarto command line. I found that recent versions of RStudio um, should come with Quarto installed, all the things you need to run Quarto. So if you have a fairly recent version of RStudio installed on your computer, you should be good to go without that separate installation. Otherwise, you'll need to install Quarto separately along with I think there's a R Quarto package as well within R. So just a quick comparison of the differences. So in R Markdown, kind of our first document we looked at was that HTML document. Just to be difficult, they changed the naming of this to be HTML instead of HTML underscore document. Um, I feel like this is a very easy way you could make a mistake when changing from R Markdown to Quarto. I actually did. I couldn't get it to work until I realized that, oh, they changed the format name there. The other thing you can see here, I had to add this option embedded resources true to mimic the behavior. It seems that by default, they that self-contained object, self-contained options for our markdown that I said was the default, is embedded resources is the kind of the comparison option there. It is by default not the case used, so you have to make sure to put that for Quarto, else you get all those files that you'll need to um, send along at the same time. But otherwise, same kind of setup here in terms of the YAML. The other difference is with the code chunk options. So in our Markdown, we had, we named our code chunks and then we put a comma and we put something like echo equals false in these brackets. For whatever reason, Quarto changed how this worked. In those documents, you actually put options with this dollar, pound sign, line, echo, colon, false below the name of the code chunk. So if you had multiple options, you would just put them on separate lines in addition below this as well. So one other kind of minor change there. And then the there's pretty much a one-to-one equivalent formats between the things we talked about, the HTML documents, the PDFs, Reveal.js, Flex dashboards between R Markdown and Quarto. Um, but you just have to use the right option here. So here is the equivalence. So HTML document, like I said, now it's just HTML. Same thing with PDF and Word. So you would use these keywords for the types instead of the R Markdown ones. But you can see there's ones for those Beamer PDF presentations or PowerPoint. It seems like Quarto does not have the same options for the IO slides and the this type of HTML document, which we didn't talk about for R Markdown. But most of the other ones, Flex dashboards, there's something called Quarto dashboards apparently now. You can do all the same kind of things. They just have different kind of keywords here. And my guess is, Quarto is still pretty new. So for the ones that don't have options yet, my guess is some of that will get filled in at some point. And so there would probably be similar options across the board or even more for Quarto going forward. So um, just for kicks, we can reknit uh, our Quarto version of example one to see the difference. I can also open it in our studio. Like we said before, HTML, everything else the same, except we've updated those options in the chunks as well. I have a newer version of R Markdown, so I can render it here and take a look. And it actually looks slightly different, I believe, than the HTML, but for the most part, everything should be exactly the same and work exactly the same from our plots to our code chunks to the embedded, the inline R code that shows up at the end here. So that's just a little bit on Quarto. You can also, I said you could knit it from the command line. So that's how I was working to make these slides. So you can type Quarto render and then the name of the document is all you need to do to render it outside of that RStudio push button stuff. So just a little bit of extra there. Okay. So our summary for today, we got R Markdown, we have Quarto. These are both really useful tools for producing reproducible reports, lightweight dashboards, other things, websites, slides. You can do lots of cool stuff with it. We can use Shiny with these when they're HTML documents. However, there are some limitations versus using a Shiny app or dashboard. My preference, if you have kind of something that's more on the complicated side, would be to always use the full Shiny version of things. If you just have a couple inputs and really like to use that Flex dashboard or something like that, that format, it may be better for you to use the R Markdown or Quarto version. But for most things, my preference would probably be to use the Shiny version of things. There's other things you can do with the combination of Shiny and R Markdown and Quarto if you're interested, just to kind of further combine these. One thing would be to actually create a Shiny dashboard that creates customizable reports that can then be downloaded by the users. So one way you can use this is you have a R Shiny dashboard, you have an R Markdown or Quarto template. the user presses a button, it knits that R Markdown with some sort of user-defined inputs, and the user can download it as well. So maybe you have some reporting type dashboard, but you want the user to be able to take something away. That is a good option that you could potentially use with that combination of things. So on the more complicated side to set up, but definitely examples out there that you can build from. And any questions on that? Okay. Um, I'll stick around if there's any additional questions, but just one more time, highlighting the final assignment reminder, information on the GitHub page. And I'll take a look at this question from Eric here in a second. But just before before we finish, just I want to say thank you to folks. Please feel free to reach out with additional questions or just to say hello. I've enjoyed putting this together and doing this for folks. Okay. A question from Eric says, uh, I think this is in the data for the assignment. The Pumas are grouped and given non-Puma codes. Um, how do we adapt for that? Also, what's the best file specific census source for Puma populations? So I might need to check that second question offline to find the best source for puma populations. I would usually just Google the on the census data.gov. There also is some R packages that use some I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head that have like an API that you can pull census data um, from that would be useful. Pumas are grouped and given non-Puma codes. I'll have to think about that. I did not realize that the Pumas were given non-Puma code. Um, if there is a way, 1 through 25, you could give them, if we need a workaround, I mean, maybe the best way to do it is just to assign them to one of the Pumas in the state. Um, and if they don't match, they don't match. I think the key thing for the assignment is kind of demonstrating that you know how to use the tools, not necessarily if they're 100% accurate data. Um, I will take a look at that. Thanks for bringing that to my attention, Eric. And I'll follow up. Okay. Thank you, Sophie. I will follow up with that afterwards and get a better answer about the Pumas. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. Other questions about either the assignment um, or the content for today? Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ashmead. This has been great.